I'm really excited to share with you how to succeed with Phalaenopsis orchids. Even if you've never had a Phalaenopsis rebloom for you, I will show you how to do that. First, we'll set up a really strong foundation care system, and then we will build on that foundation for really healthy, strong, vibrant Phalaenopsis orchids. All right, first let's start by talking about how to create a really strong care foundation for your orchids. And that begins with water. There are just 4 things you need to know about watering your orchids. First, Phalaenopsis orchids like their potting media barely damp. The second tip is to not use your aerial roots as an indicator as to whether or not your orchids need water. But there are some things that your aerial roots are telling you, and we'll talk about what those are. Third, if you are growing your orchid in sphagnum moss, remove the plastic liner pot that it came in. And fourth, we'll talk about if your orchid needs a humidity boost, we'll discuss how to give it the humidity boost it needs. All right, first, let's talk about potting media. Because Phalaenopsis orchids do not have any water storage, they like their potting media to be just barely damp. They don't ever want to be sitting in water. Here's how to keep your potting media barely damp. The first thing to do is to think about where you live. Do you live in a humid climate or in a dry climate? Because you can do things to make the potting media more or less damp depending on the potting components. The most common potting media used for orchids is fir bark. And fir bark is a really good potting media for orchids because it's a really open, free draining mix. So you can really water copiously and thoroughly, and then the water will drain out of the potting mix. So if you live in a really dry climate and you want to add more moisture, you can mix in sphagnum moss or wool rock. And you just add those things to the fir bark and it will add water retention. The second thing you can do is to add coarse perlite or clay pellets, either one of those. Coarse perlite is also known as sponge rock, and that will make the mix more open so that it's more free draining. So if you live in a place where it's really humid and you just need water to flow through more freely, then you can add either one of those components. And the clay pellets and perlite, both of those things are inorganic, and so they will also help keep your fir bark from breaking down and help it to last longer. Now let's talk about aerial roots. The first thing I want to say is don't cut them off. Some people are really bothered by them and just want to trim them away, but try not to do that. There are a couple of things that your aerial roots are telling you. So first, I want to tell you what they're not telling you. Don't look at your aerial roots to decide whether or not your orchid needs water. Instead, rather than looking at the aerial roots, look down into the potting mix. And you can see that this orchid is potted in a plastic liner pot right there. And you can just lift it up and look inside, or you can poke your finger inside, and that will tell you if your orchid needs water. If you do want to mist the aerial roots, you can just use a spray mister and mist the roots, but don't mist the leaves, just mist the roots. There are a couple of other things that your aerial roots can tell you. If your new roots all seem to be growing out as aerial roots rather than going down into the potting media, that can be an indication that your potting media, the fir bark, has decomposed, and it can also be an indication that you have really high fertilizer salts. that have absorbed into the potting mix. So if you're getting a lot of aerial roots, it can be an indication that it is past time to repot your Phalaenopsis. Let's talk about sphagnum moss and phals. A lot of times, Phalaenopsis orchids come potted in either fir bark or sphagnum moss. If your orchid is potted in sphagnum moss, I recommend removing the liner pot. And that will just allow the sphagnum moss to dry out faster so that the roots aren't sitting in water. And it will help the Phalaenopsis to grow healthier roots, and it will keep the roots from rotting. So that's just a really easy tip, and it makes a big difference. Lastly, let's talk about how to give your orchids a humidity boost. If you live in a dry climate, then this will be helpful to you. And if you live in a really humid climate, then you may not need to do this. To give your orchids a humidity boost, just find a tray. In this example, I'm using a lasagna pan, and it is pretty. It's ceramic, and it has a pretty blue glaze on it. And then I just filled the lasagna pan with some river rock and then pour water into the tray over the pebbles. The trick here is to make sure that the orchids are sitting above the water level. So that will help keep the roots out of the water and will just raise the humidity level right around your orchids. After you've mastered watering, it's time to move on to a few other tips that will help you to grow better orchids, that will help them not just to survive, but to really thrive. And it's all about location, location, location. Place your Phalaenopsis where it will receive bright, indirect light. So for a lot of people, that's an east-facing window. If you want to get technical, Phalaenopsis orchids do best with 1,000 to 1,800 foot candles of light. A foot candle is the light emitted from a candle 1 foot away. So imagine this Phalaenopsis orchid right here with 1,000 to 1,800 candles that are all lit 1 foot away from the orchid. You can download an app that will give you an accurate measurement. A lot of times the app might give the reading in lux, and that is just a metric measurement for light. And you can also download a calculator that will translate between foot candles and lux if you're worried about if your orchid is receiving enough light or not. But the light is really important. Even though Phalaenopsis orchids are considered a low light orchid, it still needs enough light that will give it the energy that it needs to rebloom. The second thing to remember is to protect your orchid from drafts and vents. And uneven temperatures can cause the new buds that are forming to wither and die. So if you've ever grown a Phalaenopsis and it looked like everything was doing great and then the buds withered and died, it's from some environmental factor. And that can be a change in temperature caused by drafts and vents, and it could also be caused by a different source, like if you gave it a lot of water and then it went through a drought situation and then it received a lot of water again. Just uneven care can cause the buds to wither and die, and also orchids are really sensitive to pollution. So those are some things that you can do to protect the buds. Also, drafts and vents can also be really drying to the orchid. So just put it in a protected area. And lastly, if you can place your orchid in a location where it receives about 4 weeks of cooler temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit or between 13 to 15.6 degrees Celsius. It will help your orchid to initiate blooming. Those are some tips to get your orchid to flower again. After your orchid has flowered, and the flowers have dropped, the first thing that people want to know is where to cut the flower stalk. And if you can see right here is the crown, the very base of the Phalaenopsis, and then right here is the flower stalk. This is called a node. So, and you'll notice these little nodes or notches all the way up the flower stalk. So what I recommend is that you go to the very last node, the one that's closest to the crown here, and then trim it about 1 inch above the last node. And that will help your Phalaenopsis to recover and regenerate and grow a whole new flower stalk. Some people want to know how they can get their orchid to grow 2 flower stalks. The answer to that is it is very tricky to do that. And the best thing to do is just plan on growing 1 flower stalk at a time, and if you get really lucky, you'll grow 2. And it happens, and it's happened to me several times, but it's not something I can really plan on. The orchid growers that have theirs that are growing them commercially, they have really specialized conditions that they use to help them to grow Phalaenopsis with 2 flower stalks. But as home growers, it's just kind of a tricky thing to accomplish. That's my recommendation. 1 inch above the last flower stalk. It's the best way to or the best place to cut your flower stalk. The next thing to do is to prevent pests and disease, because it is much easier to prevent than it is to treat. The first thing is to grow a healthy orchid. A strong plant is much more likely to be able to fight off pests and disease than a struggling plant. A struggling plant is much more likely to succumb to pests and disease. So good watering practices that we talked about, and placing it in a really good location where it receives bright light and is free from drafts is a good start in being able to care for a healthy orchid. The next thing is to use good hygiene. So right here I have my kitchen torch that I love, and I just use my kitchen torch to pass the flame over my shears, just the tips, and that will sterilize the shears and keep the shears clean and sanitary, so that if I do happen to have a bug or a pathogen, I won't pass it between orchids. So before and after you use your shears, just pass it through the flame for about 20 seconds or so. And that will help to keep your orchids really healthy. The second thing to do is to provide air movement. When you have a fan, right here, I just have this fan overlaid over this image here, but you don't want to point the fan directly at the orchids. You want to point it away from the orchids, but just set it to the lowest setting. If you have a ceiling fan, you can turn that on. And if the weather is nice outside, you can crack a window. And the reason the air movement is so important is that it helps to keep bacterial and fungal infections from taking hold of your orchids. Also, right after watering your orchids, you might have some water on the leaves, and a fan will help to dry the leaves, and especially down in the crown. That can cause rot. So it's just a simple thing, but it makes a big difference. Here's how to check your orchids for pests and disease. When you are watering your orchids or it's a change of season, that's a really good time to just make a thorough inspection. Look under the leaves, look down in the crown, inspect the flowers, look at the flower stalk. Just really carefully look at your orchid. You can even put on some magnifying glasses if you need to really give your orchid a good overall inspection. The next thing you can do is to give it a sniff. If you smell something really bad, that means that your orchid has a bacterial infection. If it just has spotting, then it can be either bacterial or fungal. And one way to prevent rot, like I said before, is to just provide your orchid with good air movement. Spotting can be an indication of bacterial or fungal infections. Viral infections are tricky. And one of the reasons that they're tricky is, well, they're tricky for several reasons. One is that they can mimic both bacteria and fungal infections. And the other reason they're tricky is that they're impossible to diagnose and treat without sending them in to a lab. You can send in a tissue sample to verify that, in fact, yes, you do have a viral infection. One of the key indicators is streaking on leaves and flowers. And again, the streaking could mimic a bacterial or fungal infection, but streaking is also an indication of viral infections. And the best thing to do is to just toss a plant that you think might have a bacterial infection. And if you love the orchid, or it was a really expensive orchid, or has really important sentimental value, then just keep it separate from all your other orchids and don't use the same tools on that orchid. Like if you have some pruning shears or whatever you use to take care of your orchids, just have some that are special for the orchid that you believe has a viral infection. The last thing to do is to check it for environmental changes. Look right here. You can see that this bud right here has withered and died. So something went wrong. It could have gotten a little cold, or maybe I didn't water it consistently. Maybe it was exposed to a little bit of air pollution. So you just want to keep track and make sure that your environment is really stable for your orchid as much as possible. Let's talk about fertilizing your Phalaenopsis. The mantra that is often repeated when fertilizing orchids is weekly, weekly. So this just means that you will feed your orchid 2 or 3 times a month, and then you will flush the fertilizer salts that are the carriers for the minerals in the fertilizers 1 to 2 times per month. It's important to dilute the fertilizer to 1/2 to 1/4 strength. And the reason that fertilizer is diluted is because Phalaenopsis orchids are epiphytes and they grow on host trees. They don't damage the trees, but the roots wrap around the branches of trees, and so they don't grow down into soil, but they grow on the tree. So the water that they receive is really pure, clean water without a lot of minerals. So Phalaenopsis orchids don't need a lot of fertilizer. So if you're just fertilizing 2 to 3 times a month and then flushing with water on the times that you don't fertilize, then it will help your orchid to grow properly and will keep it from absorbing too many salts. Another thing that you can do is to use a balanced and complete fertilizer. A balanced fertilizer just means that the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are all represented in equal amounts. And that just makes fertilizing easier. I would say something like 7-7-7 or 10-10-10 or something like that. And that just means that the macronutrients are represented in equal amounts. The other thing to remember is to use a fertilizer that says that it is a complete fertilizer. And a complete fertilizer just means that not only does the fertilizer contain macronutrients, but it also contains micronutrients, and those are things like calcium and magnesium and other things like that that your orchid needs to grow properly. Let's talk about potting tips. So the reason that you would want to repot your orchid is that over time, potting media does break down, especially if you use fir bark or any other organic potting mix. Even sphagnum moss is organic and it breaks down. And both of those things break down and they compress, and so the orchid roots receive less oxygen and the roots can start to rot and decompose because there's not a lot of airspace in a decomposed potting mix. Potting mix can also absorb a lot of fertilizer salts, like we talked about. The potting mix that I use is from Bonsai Jack, and it's a really high quality mix without a lot of dust, and the fir bark will last 1 to 2 years. The other thing that's really nice about fir bark is that you can add things to it, and also a terracotta pot will help to absorb moisture away from the roots. If you live in a dry climate, you can add wool rock or even sphagnum moss, and that just adds a little bit more moisture. And if you use a plastic pot, those are also more water retaining. A good time to pot is after the flowers have faded. That's the best time to repot a Phalaenopsis orchid. I am confident that if you use these 5 tips that I've talked about, you will be able to successfully grow a Phalaenopsis orchid, and not just grow healthy roots and leaves, but you will also be able to grow a Phalaenopsis orchid that will reflower for you. So just to review, remember to keep the potting mix barely damp. Second, don't use aerial roots as an indication to when you need to water. Stick your finger down into the potting mix, or if it's in a plastic pot, just lift it up and look for water condensation, and that will tell you when you need to water. Third, if your orchid is growing in sphagnum moss, remove the liner pot so that the roots will receive enough oxygen and that it will dry out faster. If you live in a dry climate, use a humidity tray if needed. If you've got watering down, you're ready for more advanced care. You're ready to fertilize regularly. You are ready to pot when needed. You've got the basics down, and you're ready to do the things that you need to get your orchid to reflower. All right, and there you have it. I am confident that if you follow the tips given in this video, that you will be able to successfully grow Phalaenopsis orchids. Orchids with healthy roots, with healthy leaves, and orchids that will reflower for you, and you'll be able to enjoy them year after year. And if you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you would like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.